The Vekaru Combat Academy had accepted exactly one human cadet in its 400-year history, and most of the instructors still weren't sure why. Cadet Priya Anand was small by any species standard, barely reaching the shoulder of the shortest Thrall classmate, and she had spent her first 3 months at the academy being quietly, politely underestimated by everyone from the mess hall staff to the combat theory professor who kept forgetting to call on her. She didn't correct anyone. She took notes. She ran the mandatory drills without complaint and placed, consistently, somewhere in the unremarkable middle of the class rankings. Good enough not to wash out, not good enough to be interesting. Nobody at the academy knew that unremarkable middle of the rankings was, for Priya, a deliberate and carefully maintained lie. She had learned early, back on Earth, in a childhood she didn't discuss, that being underestimated was a resource. You didn't waste a resource by spending it early. So when the seminar hall doors blew inward at 1,140 hours during advanced diplomatic theory, 31 cadets and one aging Vekaru instructor packed into a room with exactly 2 exits, both now compromised, Priya's first thought was not fear. It was finally. The intruder was Thrall cast, 7 feet of gray-plated muscle wrapped in a stealth weave suit that had gotten him past 4 layers of academy security, a monofilament blade in each hand, and the particular loose-shouldered calm of someone who had done this exact job many times before and expected to do it again in about 90 seconds. He'd been paid to kill Ambassador Daskelrin's son, a soft-spoken Vekaru cadet named Finn who was seated, at that moment, 3rd row back, frozen with the specific paralysis of a 19-year-old who has never once in his life had to consider that he might die today. The assassin's eyes swept the room in the standard threat assessment pattern he'd used on 11 previous jobs. Instructor, dismiss. Old, unarmed, will cower. Cadets nearest the exits, dismiss. Panic reflex, they'll scatter, not fight. Cadets nearest the target, note, potential interference, low priority. And near the back, small, human, statistically the weakest species in the room by every combat metric the Academy's own admissions data listed. Dismiss. It was the last threat assessment he ever made. He crossed the room in 4 strides, blade rising toward Finn's exposed throat, already calculating his exit vector through the western corridor, and the human was suddenly not in the back of the room anymore. She had moved during his 4th stride, while his attention was locked on the target, using the collective flinch of 30 other bodies as cover the way a fish uses a school. By the time his blade reached the arc where Finn's throat should have been, Finn was 2 feet to the left, yanked backward out of the strike zone by a hand that had closed around his collar with more force than his own combat instructor had ever demonstrated in a live drill. The assassin adjusted mid-swing, an easy correction, the kind of thing that had never failed him before, and that was the second mistake, because it meant his weight was already committed forward when the human's other hand drove, open-palmed, into the exact nerve cluster at the base of his weapon side wrist that every academy first year was theoretically taught, and that essentially nobody outside a professional soldier ever actually trained to hit under pressure. The monofilament blade clattered to the floor, still live, humming. He was good enough to recover, pivoting into a knee strike that would have folded a Vekaru cadet in half. But the human wasn't where a Vekaru cadet would have been either. She dropped, not backward like prey, but forward and down, inside his reach, where his remaining 7 feet of height and mass became a liability instead of an advantage. Later, cadets would argue for weeks about what exactly happened in the next 4 seconds, because nobody's account quite matched anyone else's, which was itself telling. What the seminar hall's ceiling recorder eventually confirmed was this: the human cadet, weighing perhaps a third of her opponent's mass, used his own forward momentum, a joint lock the academy didn't teach until 3rd year, and the flat of her own boot against the back of his knee to put 7 feet of trained killer face first into the floor hard enough to crack the ceramic tile. His second blade was still in his offhand. He tried to bring it up. She was already kneeling on the arm that held it, one hand pinning his wrist, the other braced against the back of his neck with a stillness that read, to the 30 terrified cadets watching, as something closer to boredom than exertion. "Don't," she said, not shouted. Said, in the exact tone a person might use to tell a child not to touch a hot stove, a warning offered once, out of courtesy, to someone she fully expected not to listen to. He didn't listen. He tried to buck her off, tried to twist the blade free. The sound that followed was small and clean and ended the discussion permanently. Total elapsed time from the doors blowing to the assassin lying motionless on the floor, 6 seconds. Total elapsed time from the doors blowing to a single other cadet managing to stand up, 9. The old Vekaru instructor, Professor Havagdoro, had spent 180 years teaching diplomatic theory to the children of nobles and had never, in that entire span, seen violence up close. He stood frozen at the podium, staring first at the motionless assassin, then at Priya Anand, who was already rising off the body with the brisk, faintly irritated efficiency of someone who has been interrupted mid-lecture and is now behind on her notes. She checked Fen, pulse, pupils, a 2-second assessment that was clinical rather than gentle, confirmed he was uninjured beyond shock, and only then looked up at 31 classmates staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "Someone should call security," she said. "And Finn needs water. Low blood sugar makes shock worse." Nobody moved. "Now, please," she added, and it wasn't unkind, just entirely, unnervingly calm, and that was what finally got 2 cadets scrambling for their comm units. The Academy's formal inquiry took 4 days. Security footage was reviewed by 7 separate committees, cross-referenced against the assassin's known combat record. He'd been Threll military special forces before going private, with confirmed kills on 3 worlds, and against the Academy's own admissions file for Cadet Priya Anand, human, age 19, listed hobbies, running, reading, keeping to herself. Combat aptitude, per her entrance exams. Unremarkable. "That's the part one don't understand," Havagdoro admitted, sitting across from her in his office, the recording of the incident frozen on the wall display behind him. "Your scores. Your drill performance. Middle of the class, every single evaluation, for 3 months. And then this." Priya considered the question with the same unhurried care she seemed to bring to everything. "Where I grew up," she said finally, "showing exactly how good you are, all the time, to everyone, isn't smart. It's just an invitation." She glanced at the frozen footage, the assassin, mid-fall, a heartbeat before the floor. "You learn to let people decide what you're capable of. Let them be wrong. It's not usually this useful. Mostly it just means people leave you alone. And when it is this useful, then somebody made a very expensive mistake," Priya said, "about which species gets to be the easy target." Havagdoro was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something he had not done in 180 years of teaching. He pulled up her file and, with a single keystroke, struck through every one of her prior evaluations. "The Academy doesn't have a category," he said slowly, "for a cadet who chooses her own ranking. I'm not certain this institution has ever needed one in 4 centuries. I suspect, Cadet Anand, we are about to learn." The story reached every corner of the Academy within a day, the way these things do, embellished with each retelling until half the cadets swore the assassin had been 12 feet tall and Priya had disarmed him blindfolded. She didn't correct that either. She sat in the back of Advanced Diplomatic Theory the following week, in her usual seat, taking her usual notes, and when Professor Havagdoro finally worked up the nerve to call on her, for the first time all semester, she gave a perfectly unremarkable answer about interspecies treaty precedent. Finn Doskelrin transferred his seat 2 rows back, close enough that Priya was, without ever being asked, always the closest cadet to him in every subsequent class. She never mentioned it. Neither did he. It didn't need saying. Somewhere in a Threll military intelligence file, an assassination contract was marked failed, asset terminated, cause, underestimation of subject, and quietly, without official comment, every Threll combat contractor's dossier on human cadets got a new, permanent footnote. Assessed threat level, unknown. Recommend against assumption.